Florida taught Marcus McDilda two things: to endure the heat and not to show fear. He grew up where the sun asks no permission, and dust settles on your shoes as naturally as sweat on your neck. In small towns, boys learn early on to look trouble straight in the eye, not because they were fearless, but because the rhythm of life itself would break you otherwise. Marcus wasn't born a hero. He wasn't some fairy tale giant. He didn't have a tragic scar across his cheek, and he didn't say beautiful things about honor. He was one of those American boys whom the war turned into pilots, gunners, mechanics, and sometimes names in telegrams to mothers. When the world descended into war, he couldn't see all of its cards at once. For him, it was simpler. There was his side. There was the sky. There was a machine that either obeyed you or killed you. He learned to fly the way people learn to survive. Through mistakes, through fear, through stubbornness. The sky gave him a new language. Everything there was honest. The altitude didn't lie. The engine didn't pretend. The fuel didn't forgive. And if you returned to base, it meant only one thing. Today, fate had granted you another day. By the summer of 1945, the war was already coming to an end for America. But end in war is a word that sounds false to those who still have to fly tomorrow on a mission. While politicians discuss terms, infantry still digs the ground, ships still burn, and pilots still fall into the sea or enemy territory. Marcus was one of those sent to press the final, most brutal days of the Pacific Campaign. The skies over Japan were no longer the romance of aviation, but gunpowder, debris, and the long shadows of an empire falling apart at the seams. He could not have known that his name, not that of a general, president, or scientist, would end up in a strange footnote to history. And he certainly could not have known that the weapon that would one day make him dangerously important would not be an airplane, a machine gun, or a bomb. It would be an ordinary, desperate, crude lie. August 1945 smelled like the end. Not peace, the end. Japan had already been shaken by Hiroshima. The news of a city destroyed by a single bomb had not yet sunk in, even for those who had received it. The world had seen something new, but had not yet found the right words for it. At such moments, history always outpaces human understanding. Marcus knew almost nothing about it. For most soldiers and pilots, the great secrets existed somewhere far away, behind the doors of headquarters and laboratories. They did not see the Manhattan Project, did not read the reports. They simply followed orders. He took to the skies for another combat mission, as he had done dozens of times before. The cockpit, the instruments, the tension in his shoulders, everything was familiar. Below lay enemy territory. Ahead lay a mission that had to be completed quickly and returned from alive. But war loves to turn routine into a trap. His plane went in for a low attack. The ground approached dangerously, like jaws. Fire from below struck suddenly, harshly, without warning. The metal shook. The machine, which a second ago had been obedient, became a wounded beast. A pilot always senses the moment when the plane is no longer his. First, it's a sound, then a vibration, then a strange silence inside you, when your brain has already understood everything, but your heart still pretends there is a chance to pull through. Marcus tried. Everyone tries. In this brief struggle between man and machine, there is always a glimmer of hope. Maybe I can make it. Maybe it will land. Maybe it will fly over. But war does not like maybe. He fell. Not like a hero from a poster, not beautifully, not slowly. Impact, dirt, pain, dust, deafening noise. Then hands, strangers' hands, voices, screams, a crowd, not the sky, not his own people, not salvation. He was shot down over a country that was on the verge of surrender, but still had enough hatred to beat a prisoner in the street. For civilians who had survived the bombing, the American pilot was not a human being. He was a form of war, the face of fire from the sky. They dragged him, pushed him, humiliated him. Some beat him with their fists, some with sticks, some just watched with a half-mad fury that long suffering breeds. Marcus walked because he couldn't not walk. Blood flowed, but his consciousness still held. And perhaps it was at that moment that he truly understood for the first time. Now his war was not in the sky. Now it would be in a room without windows. Questioning. He still hoped for the usual questioning. He still hoped for the usual logic of war. Name, rank, number, perhaps beatings. And then a prisoner of war camp. It was a cruel but understandable pattern. However, August 1945 no longer followed the usual rules. After Hiroshima, the Japanese were frantically searching for the answer to one question. How many more bombs does America have? For them, this wounded American pilot could be anyone. An ordinary pilot, a courier, a bearer of secrets, one of those who knew the plan for the end of their country. In a panic, even the most unlikely seems possible. They put him under a light that hurt his eyes. An interpreter, an officer, a face without pity. First, words, then blows, then words again. How many bombs? I don't know. Which cities are next? I don't know. Don't lie. He really didn't know. And that sounded like the most incredible lie to them. Marcus was not a scientist. He was not privy to state secrets. He knew nothing about nuclear fission, uranium, or how the weapons of the New World worked. But to people who were desperately trying to extract an explanation from the catastrophe, his ignorance looked like a defiant refusal to cooperate. They beat him until the pain became a constant. They threatened him with death. They brought the blade closer. They said that now everything would end. And then the most ancient survival mechanism in human consciousness kicks in. If the truth does not save you, fiction begins to work. In such moments, lies cease to be a moral issue. They become air. Marcus looked at the people who wanted to hear something specific. They didn't need, I don't know. They needed a map of horror. And he suddenly realized, if he gave them a big, convincing, scary story, maybe they would let him go. Maybe, at least, they wouldn't kill him tonight. He swallowed his blood, raised his eyes, and began to speak. Not as a spy, not as a hero, but as a man standing on the edge, buying his freedom with words. He didn't lie carefully. He lied impressively. The U.S., he said, had not 1 or 2 such bombs. They had 100. This number did not come from logic, but from instinct. It was large enough to be frightening and round enough to sound convincing to people already poisoned by panic. The interrogators froze. Marcus saw something change in the room. The doubt did not disappear, but it changed form. Now they were not just looking at a captured pilot. They were looking at a man who might have access to the most terrifying information on Earth. He continued, because to stop now would mean exposing himself. Yes, he said, there would be new strikes soon. Yes, he said, the next targets could be Tokyo and Kyoto. Why these cities? Because they were the names he knew. Because in a crisis, the brain takes what is on the surface. Because the best lie under torture is not perfect, but fast enough. He could have made up the technical details, but here too his despair gave birth to something bizarre. Pseudoscientific nonsense, a mixture of rumors, fantasies, and misconceptions. He spoke as if he himself did not fully understand what he was saying, and that, perhaps, made it all the more frightening. Because true horror rarely sounds pure. It comes in fragments, confused with hysterical details. The interrogators took notes. Perhaps some of them didn't believe a word. Perhaps some believed half of it. But in the atmosphere of a country that had already seen Hiroshima and was waiting for the next strike, even half belief could be deadly important. Marcus felt the first faint breath of relief. They hadn't killed him right away. The pain didn't go away. The fear didn't go away. But he noticed the main thing. His words had changed his status. Now he wasn't just meat to be beaten. Now he was the bearer of a possible catastrophe. Sometimes fate is turned upside down in a single room, at a single table, on a single meaningless number. 100. A word uttered in desperation went further than any bullet from his plane. The next morning they treated him differently. Not more gently, differently. It was the most frightening change. When the executioner takes a step back, it doesn't always mean mercy. Sometimes it means that your value has suddenly increased, and with it, the danger. Marcus was no longer just being guarded. He was being transported. He was beaten, exhausted, but conscious enough to understand that his lie had reached someone higher up. The people who had beaten him yesterday were now handing him over to other people. In a crumbling system, information still held its shape, and his fabrication had become part of that shape. He was being taken to Tokyo. The country that was losing the war still functioned by the inertia of power. Documents were moved, orders were passed on, prisoners were classified. Marcus, who knew nothing, was now labeled, especially valuable. There was something almost blackly comical about this irony, if it weren't for the stakes. It was not knowledge that helped him survive, but convincing nonsense. In Tokyo, the atmosphere was different. Less chaos on the streets, more coldness in the offices. Here, fear no longer screamed. It thought. Here, they didn't just want to extract words. They wanted to understand what they meant. For Marcus, this was a new test. Because the real risk for a liar is not in making something up. It's in enduring the moment when the lie begins to be checked. They transferred him, fed him, and left him waiting. And the waiting turned out to be no easier than the beating. When you're being beaten, you're busy with pain. When you're left alone, you're left with your imagination, and your imagination quickly suggests the worst. They'll be here soon. They'll figure it out soon. They'll cut the lie out of you along with your life. He sat there and, perhaps for the first time, clearly saw the absurdity of his situation. A lone pilot, shot down over a foreign country. A lone man who had saved his skin by chance yesterday. And now, perhaps, people who decide the fate of cities are discussing his fantasies. Great history is not always born of greatness. Often it is born of someone else's mistake, fear, and wrong conclusion. The door opened. It was time to meet those who could distinguish truth from panic-stricken delusion. The new interrogator was not like the previous ones. He did not have that rough, hot cruelty. He did not look like an executioner, but like a man who was used to thinking. That is what made him more dangerous. Anyone can beat someone up, but only someone who can see the cracks in other people's words can expose them. They say he was a civilian scientist, an educated man who had enough knowledge to understand that he was not dealing with a bearer of nuclear secrets. Before him was a beaten pilot who had survived by improvising. He began to ask questions differently. Not how much, but how. Not when, but explain the principle. And here, Marcus's lies began to settle like dust after an explosion. May still have retained their terrible power as a political signal. But to a person who understood science, they sounded false. The interrogator understood. Perhaps it was then, in that room, that the quietest and most human scene in the whole story took place. When they didn't get the truth out of Marcus, but saw that he was lying to stay alive. And when that became clear, the tension changed. It didn't disappear, but it changed. Now he was not the key to the mystery, but evidence of something else, how fear, torture, and panic produce false intelligence. Marcus, perhaps for the first time in days, said something close to the real truth. I said what I had to say to stay alive. That sentence said it all. Not heroism, not betrayal, just the bare law of a prisoner. Survive if you can. And strangely enough, that was what could save him a second time. Because when someone sees that you're not a spy or a bearer of secrets, sometimes they no longer see the point in killing you right away. He was not released. He was not forgiven. He was not let go. He was simply removed from the center of the drama, to a cell, to waiting, to the unknown. But the wheel of history had already turned. His lie had done its job. Even exposed, it already lived outside of him. Meanwhile, beyond the walls, far above the level of cells and interrogations, Japan stood on the brink of a choice. Empires rarely die quickly in their own minds. Even when cities are burning, even when the fleet is destroyed, even when the sky belongs to the enemy, there are always people who say, all is not lost, terms can still be negotiated, more sacrifices can still be made and called honor. After Hiroshima, the shock was terrible. After Nagasaki, it was undeniable. And between these blows, there was another force at work. Rumors, exaggerations, fear of what would happen next. It was into these cracks that Marcus's story could slip. Imagine rooms where officials, officers, and advisors argue over fragments of information. Someone brings news of a new superbomb. Someone else brings a report about a captured American pilot who says that the United States has dozens or even hundreds of such bombs. Someone doesn't believe it, someone laughs, but someone else remains silent. Because after Hiroshima, what was impossible yesterday has become a reality. In the war of recent days, not all decisions are made on the basis of pure knowledge. Often they are born from a combination of facts, incomplete data, and time pressure. If the enemy has already used one unimaginable weapon, how unimaginable is the assumption that he has more? Perhaps Marcus's words were not the decisive factor. Perhaps they were just a drop in the storm, but sometimes, in the final hours, it is the drops that matter most, because they change not the event, but the mood. The history of war often focuses on big names. Truman, the Emperor, generals, scientists. But between them there is always a dark river of minor influences. Unverified reports, rumors, translation errors, panic assessments, human guesses. In that river floated the lie of one beaten pilot. He himself did not see it. Sitting in his cell, he did not know which officers had heard it, who had rejected it, who had remembered it, who had been frightened by it. But the fact remains, when large systems fall apart, even absurdity can become a political argument for a moment. And somewhere in this general darkness, the day was approaching when the war would finally break down. Waiting is a form of punishment in itself. Time loses its shape in a prison cell. Day and night become not events, but shades of fatigue. A person begins to live not by the hour, but by sounds. Footsteps in the corridor, the creak of a lock, a stranger's cough, the distant hum of a city that does not yet know how much time it has left. Marcus sat and did not know what awaited him first. Execution, transfer, oblivion, or the random mercy of chaos. Prisoners often survive not through courage, but through a strange ability to break down fear. Not to think about everything. Think about one more hour, about a sip of water, about the need to sit quietly, about the fact that the next sound could mean anything. And so, as long as it hasn't come yet, you're still alive. Somewhere far away, big politics was at work. Here, in the cell, the small physiology of survival was at work. He was probably thinking about home, not about the pomp and circumstance, but about simple things. The Florida air, the sound of voices, the land that was not hostile, mornings without interrogations. In captivity, a person almost always dreams not of glory, but of banality, of a normal life that once seemed invisible. But even in his cell, he couldn't escape one question. Did they believe him? And a second, even worse one, what if they believed him too much? Because a lie told for self-defense can have consequences that no longer belong to the liar. It could have saved him, but it could also become part of a new wave of decisions, new deaths, new fear. It's a burden that only appears after the acute horror recedes. At first, you just don't want to die. Only then do you start to think about what you've done to survive. Outside, the world was rolling towards its conclusion. The emperor was preparing words that Japan had never heard before. The generals were arguing. Some wanted to keep fighting, others wanted to stop. And over all this hung the shadow of a new weapon, not fully understood, but terrifying enough to reshape the very language of war. In his cell, Marcus was not a historical agent. He was just a body waiting. And yet, sometimes this is what the crux of history looks like. Not on a podium, not in a headquarters, but in a stuffy room where one person sits in the dark, unaware that the world is already deciding what tomorrow will bring. The end of major wars rarely resembles a triumphant finale. More often than not, it looks like disorientation. Orders are still coming in, but they contradict each other. Guards still carry weapons, but they no longer know whether they have the right to shoot. Prisoners are still behind bars, but the locks already belong to yesterday's world. When Japan surrendered, it did not mean that order and mercy reigned everywhere at that very moment. On the contrary, it is precisely at moments of collapse of authority that the people at the bottom often become the most dangerous. Offended, angry, humiliated by defeat, they may decide that the last thing left for them is to take revenge on those who held them captive. Marcus was lucky in a terrible, rare way. His transfer to Tokyo, a result of that very lie, could have saved his life, because in other places, American prisoners did not always live to see freedom. In the chaos of surrender, some were killed literally on the threshold of the end of the war. He waited for liberation. One can imagine this moment not as a beautiful scene, but as a slow, incredulous return to reality. First, new faces, then a different uniform. Then someone speaks English. Then the brain still doesn't believe it, because the body has lived too long under the laws of captivity. Freedom after captivity does not burst in with fanfare. It approaches cautiously, almost shyly. Marcus, beaten, exhausted, still alive, emerged from that period of history not as a victor, but as a man who had miraculously been allowed to survive. He did not know if anyone would remember his name, and probably he didn't care. After all he had been through, the greatest reward was not fame, but the right to breathe again without permission. And somewhere nearby, on a completely different scale, the war that had engulfed continents was coming to an end. The world quickly began to rewrite itself into a new era. Atomic, cold, nervous. Historians were busy with generals, diplomats, bombs, dates, and declarations. And Marcus McDilda remained a strange footnote. A man who survived so desperately that he may have inadvertently added another drop of fear to the cup from which the empire already had to drink. After the war, such stories often live a half-life. They do not become the main subjects of textbooks, but they do not disappear completely either. They are passed on as strange, almost unbelievable episodes. For example, there was a guy from Florida who was shot down over Japan, and under torture he invented so many atomic bombs that he may have frightened the enemy more than the truth. People are drawn to such stories because they have everything: irony, horror, chance, human ingenuity, and that paradox of history where a minor figure suddenly casts a long shadow. But the most interesting thing about this story is not the myth of the man who ended the war. The most interesting thing is what Marcus actually did. He didn't press the button. He didn't negotiate. He didn't command armies. He didn't discover nuclear physics. He did something much more prosaic and much more human. He didn't allow himself to be killed at a moment when the truth didn't work. His act was not heroic in the romantic sense. It was raw, instinctive, almost animalistic. And that is precisely why it was so compelling. There is no glamour of legend in it. There is only sweat, blood, horror, and a lightning-fast assessment. These people want to hear something terrible. If I give it to them, I might survive the night. And yet there is a harsh historical irony in this. In the 20th century, which prided itself on reason, machines, science, and bureaucracy, one of the strangest possible influences on the outcome of the greatest war could have come through panic, torture, and the crude lies of a prisoner. This story also reminds us of something else. Torture does not produce the truth. It produces whatever is needed to stop the pain. Sometimes it is silence. Sometimes it is fantasy. Sometimes it is 100 atomic bombs. Marcus McDilda was not the man who single-handedly ended World War II. That would be too simple for such a complex tragedy. But he was a man whose desperate lies became part of the last hysterical rustle of that war. And perhaps that is how he should be remembered. Not as a superhero, not as a joke, but as a living reminder that sometimes history is changed not only by grand plans, but also by the small decisions of people who have been backed into a corner. One number, one night, one prisoner, and one lie that turned out to be big enough to be heard.